No me gatoches me. Ever. Mason Cole did not raise his voice, but the word stopped Ethan Brooks 3 steps inside the private hospital suite. Ethan had been warned before entering. Suite 12 belonged to a 39-year-old Alpha whose name made experienced nurses lower their voices, whose security occupied both ends of the restricted Manhattan corridor, and whose single rule had already sent 2 Omega nurses requesting reassignment. Ethan looked at the man sitting upright beneath the muted glow of the bedside monitor. Mason looked nothing like someone accustomed to being vulnerable. Even dressed in a hospital shirt, he carried himself with the controlled stillness of a man who expected rooms to adjust around him. Understood, Ethan said. Mason's gray eyes narrowed slightly. That is all. Ethan parked the medication cart nearly 4 feet from the bed. You gave me a boundary, not a puzzle. For the first time, something shifted behind Mason's expression. It was not amusement exactly, but it was close. Ethan opened the electronic chart and reviewed the orders. Mason had been admitted after collapsing during a business meeting, and the physicians were monitoring him while adjusting medication for an irregular heart rhythm. His condition was currently stable. That was the important part. Whatever happened beyond these hospital walls was irrelevant to Ethan's job. They told you who I am, Mason said. They told me you are Mason Cole, 39 years old, allergic to penicillin, and terrible at following rest instructions. Mason stared at him. Ethan glanced at the chart. That last part is documented. Mason almost smiled, then apparently decided against it. You are new to this floor, and an Omega. Ethan finally met his gaze. Also documented. Silence settled between them. Rain traced silver lines down the tall windows, and Manhattan glittered 40 floors below. Ethan checked the monitor from a distance, then verified the intravenous pump without touching Mason. Every action was deliberate. No challenge. No nervousness. No unnecessary movement toward the bed. Mason seemed increasingly unsettled by how ordinary Ethan made the situation feel. Most people are afraid of breaking my rules, Mason said. I'm more concerned with understanding them. Ethan reviewed the newest medication order. It had started 17 minutes earlier. If your rule interferes with necessary care, I will tell you before I do anything. Mason's expression cooled. You will not touch me. Ethan looked up. Then let us hope your body respects the rule too. That finally earned a reaction. Mason's eyebrows lifted, and for half a second the Ruthless Alpha looked genuinely surprised. Ethan returned his attention to the chart, but something at the edge of his vision made him pause. Mason had been perfectly still when Ethan entered. Now the fingers of his right hand trembled once against the blanket, small enough to miss. Then again, Ethan looked at the monitor. Nothing alarming. He looked back at Mason. His breathing had changed too, barely enough to notice, but Ethan noticed. 17 minutes since the new medication began. Ethan slowly lowered the tablet. Mason, he said, his voice suddenly serious, I need you to answer my next question very carefully. Are you feeling warmer than you were 5 minutes ago? Ethan asked. Mason's eyes stayed on him. No. Lightheaded. No. Pressure in your chest? Nausea? Trouble taking a full breath? Mason's jaw tightened. I said I'm fine. Ethan did not argue. He looked at the monitor again. Mason's heart rate had climbed from 78 to 94 beats per minute. Still not automatically dangerous, but the number mattered less than the direction. Ethan checked the medication order, and its start time once more. 20 minutes. He looked back at Mason. The faint tremor had returned, and a flush now touched the Alpha's cheeks. Your definition of fine needs work, Ethan said. Mason glanced toward the monitor. The machine disagrees with you. The machine gives me numbers. I am looking at the patient. That silenced him. Ethan stepped closer to the intravenous pump, but remained outside Mason's reach. The medication was running at the ordered rate. Nothing obvious was wrong with the equipment. That only strengthened Ethan's concern. I need to listen to your breathing and check your pulse manually. Mason's expression hardened immediately. No, Ethan nodded once. Then I need you to understand why I am asking. Your heart rate is trending upward. Your breathing pattern has changed. Your hand is trembling and your face is flushed. Those changes began after the new medication started. Mason looked at his right hand as though noticing the tremor for the first time. You are guessing. I am observing. Ethan pressed the staff assistance button beside the wall and returned his attention to Mason. There is a difference. The monitor sounded a soft alert. Mason's heart rate reached 106. His controlled expression did not disappear, but Ethan saw something new beneath it. Uncertainty. Stop looking at that screen, Ethan said. Mason's eyes snapped toward him. Look at me instead. Take a slow breath. Mason tried. The breath ended sooner than the previous ones. Ethan felt his concern sharpen. He remained calm because panic would accomplish nothing. I'm going to pause the infusion according to hospital protocol while we verify the reaction, Ethan said. He moved to the pump, stopped the medication, and checked the line without touching Mason. Someone else can examine me, Mason said. They can, and I called them. Ethan glanced toward the closed door. No nurse had arrived yet. The floor was busy with another patient situation 2 rooms away. He turned back. But right now, I am here. Mason's gaze became cold again, as if authority could force his body back into obedience. Ethan had seen that look in frightened patients before. Fear did not always look like fear. Sometimes it wore expensive watches and gave orders. How long? Mason asked. Until someone comes? I do not know. Then wait. Ethan watched another shallow breath. The monitor showed 112. Waiting is still a decision, Ethan said quietly. And right now is becoming the wrong one. Mason stared at him. Ethan picked up his stethoscope, but did not approach. I will tell you exactly what I need to do before I do it. I will touch only what is medically necessary, and I will stop the moment the assessment is complete. You expect me to trust you? Mason asked. Ethan held his gaze. No, I expect you to make an informed choice. For several seconds, neither man moved. Then, Mason slowly pulled his right hand from beneath the blanket and placed it on top, palm turned slightly upward. His voice was quieter when he spoke. My wrist. Nothing else. Ethan stepped forward. Your wrist. Nothing else. Your wrist. Nothing else. Ethan repeated, making sure Mason heard the boundary exactly as he had said it. He approached the bed slowly and placed 2 fingers against Mason's wrist. The contact lasted only seconds, but Mason became completely still. Ethan ignored the intensity of the Alpha's stare and concentrated on the pulse beneath his fingertips. Fast, stronger than expected, and slightly irregular. 116, Ethan said. I am finished. He removed his hand immediately and stepped back. Mason looked at his wrist, then at Ethan, almost as if the nurse had surprised him more by stopping than by touching him. The door opened moments later, and the charge nurse entered with the on-call physician. Ethan gave a concise report. The medication start time, the rising heart rate, the altered breathing, the tremor, the facial flushing, and the manual pulse assessment. He explained that he had paused the infusion according to protocol. The physician moved through the examination while Ethan remained nearby, answering questions and documenting every change. Mason did not object to the medical team. His attention kept returning to Ethan. Over the next 20 minutes, the room gradually lost its tension. The discontinued medication was flagged for review, an alternative treatment plan was ordered, and Mason's breathing became easier. His heart rate moved steadily downward. 104, 98, 91. Ethan watched the trend without celebrating. Improvement mattered more than being proven right. When the physician finally said Mason was stable, Ethan released a breath he had not realized he was holding. You noticed before the monitor alarmed, Mason said after the others left. Ethan returned to the workstation. The monitor noticed numbers. I noticed you. Mason studied him. That sounds dangerously close to confidence. It is nursing. Ethan entered the final notes into the chart. There is less mystery involved than people think. Rain continued tapping softly against the windows. Mason's security remained outside, but inside Suite 12 the atmosphere had changed. The room no longer felt divided between a powerful patient and the Omega forbidden to approach him. It felt like a hospital room again. Ethan checked the clock. His shift still had several hours remaining. I will return in 30 minutes to reassess you, he said. Mason's gaze sharpened. Will you touch me again? Ethan paused near the door. Only if it is necessary, and only after I ask. Mason seemed genuinely confused. I already allowed it. You allowed one pulse check. Ethan turned toward him. Permission for one thing does not become permission for everything after it. For several seconds, Mason said nothing. Then his expression softened by a degree so small most people would have missed it. Ethan did not. You always make everything this complicated? Mason asked. I think I make it simpler. Ethan reached for the door. People just get careless with simple things. 30 minutes later, Ethan returned exactly when promised. Mason was awake, his heart rate stable in the low 80s. Ethan checked the monitor and reviewed the updated orders. I need another manual pulse, he said. May I? Mason looked at his wrist, then extended his arm. This time, there was less hesitation. Ethan completed the assessment and stepped away. 82. Regular. Mason nodded. Ethan started toward the workstation, but Mason stopped him with a quiet question. What does your shift end? 7 in the morning. Mason looked toward the dark Manhattan skyline and then back at him. And tomorrow? Ethan raised an eyebrow. Why? Mason settled against the pillows, his voice returning to its controlled calm. Because tomorrow I want the same nurse. Because tomorrow I want the same nurse. Ethan heard the words again when he returned to Suite 12 the following evening, although Mason did not repeat them. He did not need to. One of the security men opened the door before. Ethan reached it, and Mason was waiting upright against the pillows with a tablet resting beside him. His heart rate was steady, his breathing normal, and the medication that had caused the previous reaction was gone from his treatment plan. You came back, Mason said. Ethan rolled the medication cart into position. I work here. Most people would consider reassignment. Most people apparently enjoy creating paperwork. A faint smile touched Mason's mouth before disappearing. Ethan reviewed the updated orders, then picked up the blood pressure cuff. He stopped several feet from the bed. I need your arm. Mason extended it immediately. Ethan remained where he was. That was not permission. Mason's eyebrows drew together. You checked my pulse twice last night. Last night was last night. Ethan waited. May I take your blood pressure? Mason stared at him for several seconds before answering. Yes. Ethan approached, completed the assessment, removed the cuff, and stepped away. 118/74. Very good. Mason looked at his arm. You really intend to ask every time? Yes. Even after I have already trusted you? Ethan entered the reading into the chart. Especially then. The answer seemed to follow Mason long after the assessment ended. Near midnight, Ethan found him awake beside the rain-darkened window, staring across Manhattan. You have been unusually quiet, Ethan said. Should I be concerned? You are not afraid of me. Ethan leaned lightly against the workstation. Is that a medical question? It is a question. Mason turned from the window. Everyone on this floor knows who I am. You know who I am. Yet you speak to me like I am ordinary. In this room, you are a patient. That's simple. It should be. Mason studied him with an expression Ethan could not immediately read. There was another Omega once. Ethan stayed silent. Mason looked back toward the city. He had access to my home, my schedule, people I trusted. I believed loyalty meant I never had to question him. His voice remained controlled, but the control itself revealed how carefully the memory was contained. Then information I considered private stopped being private. Business arrangements collapsed. People disappeared from my life. By the time I understood where the breach began, trust had already become a liability. Ethan did not offer sympathy Mason had not requested. So you made a rule. I made several, and eventually one person became an entire category of people. Mason turned sharply. Ethan held his gaze. One person broke your trust, Ethan said. That does not make every Omega guilty. Mason's expression hardened, but he did not argue. Before either man could continue, movement beyond the narrow glass panel in the door caught Ethan's attention. An orderly stood outside beside a medication cart, speaking quietly with one of Mason's guards. Ethan straightened. Something about the uniform was correct enough to pass at a glance, but the identification badge carried a green stripe. Support staff authorized for this restricted floor wore blue. Ethan looked at the cart next. Its inventory tag belonged to another unit. What is it? Mason asked. Ethan moved toward the door, but did not open it. That man does not belong on this floor. Mason reached toward the bedside phone. I will have my people handle it. No. Ethan pressed the hospital assistance button instead. Mason stared at him. Ethan kept his eyes on the stranger beyond the glass. Your security protects you, he said calmly. Hospital security protects access. Right now, I need both systems doing their own jobs. Your security protects you. Hospital security protects access. Right now, I need both systems doing their own jobs. Mason's hand remained near the bedside phone, but after a long second, he lowered it. Ethan kept the suite door closed and contacted the charge nurse, giving the identification badge color, the cart number, and the stranger's location without making assumptions about his intent. Mason watched him with the same concentrated expression he usually reserved for people trying to negotiate with him. You noticed a stripe on a badge from across the room? He asked. I noticed something that did not match. There is a difference. A big one. Within minutes, hospital security arrived in the corridor. Ethan stayed inside with Mason while the credentials were checked. There was no confrontation, only quiet questions beyond the glass and several phone calls. Eventually, the unfamiliar orderly and medication cart were escorted away from the restricted floor for verification. The charge nurse entered shortly afterward. His credentials were not authorized for this unit, she explained. Security is reviewing how he gained access. Until we know more, all medication deliveries to this floor will require a second verification. Ethan nodded. Was anything delivered to this room? Not according to the current record. When she left, Mason looked toward his guards outside the door, then back at Ethan. 2 trained men were standing 6 feet from him. They were checking for threats to you, Ethan said. I was checking whether he belonged here. Mason leaned back against the pillows, and apparently he did not. Ethan returned to the workstation. That is what verification is for. You keep seeing things other people miss. I pay attention. That sounds suspiciously like modesty. Ethan glanced over. Do not worry. I have several worse qualities. Mason laughed once, quietly, and the sound seemed strange in a room that had held so much tension. Ethan prepared the blood pressure cuff for the scheduled assessment. He approached the bed, then stopped. May I? Mason extended his arm. You still have to ask? Yes. Even after tonight? Especially after tonight. Mason considered that, then nodded. Yes, Ethan. You may. It was the first time Mason had used his first name. Ethan noticed, but did not react. He completed the assessment, removed the cuff, and stepped away. 120/76. Good. Boring. My favorite kind of result. Mason watched him enter the numbers. You know, I could hire you. Ethan looked up slowly. That sounded less like a hypothetical than you probably intended. Private medical staff. Better schedule. Better pay. Whatever number makes sense. Ethan set the tablet down. No. Mason blinked. You have not heard the number. That is because the number is not the problem. Everyone has a number. Then consider me inconvenient. Mason's expression became unreadable. Ethan expected irritation, but what appeared instead was curiosity. Why refuse? Mason asked. Ethan looked directly at him. Because you finally found someone you trust, and your first instinct is to put him somewhere you can control. The room became silent. Mason's gaze shifted toward the window. Ethan continued more gently. You told me what happened before. I understand why certainty feels safe to you. But hiring certainty is not the same thing as learning to trust. Mason remained quiet for several seconds. And what does trust look like to you? Ethan picked up the tablet again. Sometimes it looks like letting someone say no and discovering they're still standing beside you afterward. Mason looked back at him, and for once, the Alpha Mafia boss had no immediate answer. Sometimes it looks like letting someone say no and discovering they are still standing beside you afterward. Mason remained quiet long enough that Ethan wondered whether the conversation had finally crossed a line. Then Mason looked toward the rain-darkened Manhattan skyline. I built my life around eliminating uncertainty, he said. People call that preparation. Sometimes it is, Ethan replied. Sometimes it is fear wearing an expensive suit. Mason turned back, and to Ethan's surprise, There was no anger in his expression. You really do have worse qualities. I warned you. Near 1 in the morning, Ethan returned to the workstation to review Mason's medication record before the next scheduled dose. The security issue had made the entire floor more careful, and Ethan checked every entry twice. One timestamp stopped him. A routine verification had been entered at 12:47 under another nurse's credentials. Ethan knew that nurse had been responding to an emergency on the opposite side of the floor at that exact time. He checked the staffing record, then checked the medication entry again. The information looked legitimate. The timing did not. Mason noticed the change in his face. What did you find? Something I need to verify. Ethan contacted the charge nurse and explained the discrepancy without speculation. She arrived several minutes later and reviewed the record beside him. Her expression tightened. You are right. She could not have entered this from here. The charge nurse contacted hospital administration and security while Ethan stayed with Mason. Mason reached toward his phone, then stopped himself. What do you need me to do? Ethan looked at him. Yesterday, Mason would have given orders before anyone finished explaining the problem. Now he was asking, stay here. Let the hospital trace the access. Mason nodded once. All right. The investigation continued quietly through the early morning. No evidence suggested that Mason's medication had been altered, but the questionable account was restricted while administrators reviewed the access history. Around 5, Ethan found Mason awake by the window under his approved mobility plan. You should be resting. You say that as though I have ever impressed you with my obedience. You have not. Mason almost smiled. The record looked normal, did not? By itself, yes. Then how did you know? Ethan considered the question. Because records are only one part of the story. Machines give numbers. Charts give documentation. People create patterns. When those things disagree, I pay attention. Mason studied him, like my breathing before the monitor alarmed. Exactly. And the badge. Exactly. Mason looked toward the waking city. You make it sound simple. It is simple. Simple does not mean easy. By sunrise, security confirmed that another employee's credentials had been used without authorization. The hospital continued its internal review, but Mason's treatment remained secure. Ethan approached with a blood pressure cuff. Final assessment before shift change. May I? Mason extended his arm, then paused. Instead of assuming Ethan understood, he met his eyes. Yes, Ethan, you may. Ethan completed the assessment and stepped back. Mason watched him remove the cuff. I think I finally understand why you keep asking. Why? Because trust is not permission you collect once. Ethan gave a small nod. Mason looked at his open hand for a moment before lowering it. It is a choice someone keeps making. For the first time since Ethan had entered Suite 12, Mason did not sound like a man surrendering control. He sounded like a man discovering he could choose something better. By the time Ethan returned for his next evening shift, Suite 12 looked less like a guarded fortress and more like a room preparing to become empty. Mason's discharge had been approved after the hospital confirmed that his treatment records were secure, although the investigation into the unauthorized credentials continued separately. Mason stood near the window in dark slacks and a white shirt, watching Manhattan brighten beneath the early evening lights. You are supposed to be sitting, Ethan said as he entered. Mason glanced over. Good evening to you too. Sitting first. Good evening second. To Ethan's surprise, Mason returned to the bed without argument. Ethan reviewed the discharge orders, follow-up appointments, medication schedule, and activity restrictions. When he reached the instruction requiring several days of reduced activity, Mason gave him a skeptical look. That seems excessive. Your cardiologist disagrees. My cardiologist does not know my schedule. Your heart does not care about your schedule. Mason almost smiled. Ethan finished reviewing the paperwork and placed the folder beside him. Any questions? Mason looked at the folder, but did not pick it up. 1. Ethan waited. My offer still stands. The room became quieter. Ethan knew immediately which offer he meant. My answer does too. I could change the terms. That would not change the problem. Mason leaned back slightly. You believe I am trying to control you. I believe you are trying to control uncertainty. Ethan kept his voice even. You finally trusted someone, and your first reaction was to make sure that person stayed available. Better salary, private employment, whatever conditions make leaving less likely. Mason's expression tightened, but he remained silent. Ethan continued, "You are trying to hire certainty. And if I am, then you still have not learned what trust costs." Mason's gray eyes sharpened. "You said trust was a choice." "It is, which means the other person must remain free to make a different choice." Ethan rested the discharge folder on the bedside table. "If I work for you because you made refusing impossible, you have certainty. You do not have trust." Mason looked toward the window. For several seconds, Ethan heard only the quiet rhythm of the monitor. "I spent years making sure people could not surprise me," Mason finally said. "That kept me alive professionally. Maybe, but also taught you to treat every unknown as a threat." Mason considered that, including you, especially me. A faint, humorless smile crossed Mason's face. "You walked into my room, questioned my judgment, ignored my reputation, and found two problems my security missed. That is a dramatic description of nursing. You also said no to me twice. 3 times, if we count the rest argument." This time Mason genuinely smiled. Then the expression faded into something quieter. "I will not ask again." Ethan studied him carefully. "About the job?" "About the job." There was no bargaining hidden behind the words. No revised offer. No demand for reassurance. Mason simply accepted the boundary. Ethan nodded. "Thank you." Mason looked almost surprised by the response. Ethan picked up the blood pressure cuff for the final scheduled assessment and stopped beside the bed. "May I?" Mason extended his arm, then deliberately answered aloud. "Yes." Ethan completed the reading and removed the cuff. 116/72. Apparently following instructions occasionally works. Mason looked at him. "Do not become accustomed to it." Ethan stepped back, but Mason's next words stopped him. "Ethan, when I leave tomorrow, I do not want you to come with me." Ethan raised an eyebrow. Mason continued quietly. "I think that might be the first time I have trusted someone enough to let him stay exactly where he chose to be. I think that might be the first time I have trusted someone enough to let him stay exactly where he chose to be." Ethan carried those words with him through the rest of the shift. By morning, Mason was dressed in a charcoal coat, his discharge papers tucked beneath one arm. His security waited outside Suite 12, but Mason did not hurry toward them. He stood beside the bed and looked around the room where control had slowly become something different. "You have everything?" Ethan asked. "Medication instructions, follow-up appointment, activity restrictions?" "Including the part where you expect me to rest." "Especially that part." Mason gave him a restrained smile. Then his expression became serious. "Thank you, Ethan." Ethan knew he was not talking only about the medication reaction. "Take care of yourself, Mason." Mason nodded and walked out. Ethan watched the doorway for only a moment before returning to work. He assumed that was where their story would become a memory. 3 days later, Ethan finished another night shift shortly after 7 in the morning and crossed the hospital lobby toward the street. He had slept badly, wanted coffee, and was already thinking about the subway ride home when he saw Mason sitting near the tall glass windows with 2 paper cups on the table beside him. Ethan stopped. Mason stood. "Are you feeling all right?" Ethan asked immediately. "I am fine." "Chest discomfort?" "No." "Dizziness?" "Ethan." Mason's mouth curved slightly. "I am not here as a patient." That answer somehow made Ethan more cautious. "Then why are you here?" Mason picked up one of the cups. "Coffee." Ethan stared at it. "You came to a hospital at 7 in the morning to give a nurse coffee?" "I was told ordinary people sometimes do this." Ethan laughed before he could stop himself. Mason looked pleased with the result. "There's a coffee shop 2 blocks east," Mason continued. "I thought I could ask whether you wanted to join me after your shift. No order. No private employment contract. No assumption that Ethan would say yes." Mason simply waited. Ethan studied him for several seconds. "1 coffee." Mason nodded. 1 coffee. Outside, the January air was cold enough to make Ethan pull his coat tighter. A black sedan waited at the curb. Mason gestured toward it. "We can drive." Ethan looked east. It is 2 blocks. It is 28 degrees. You survived hospital food. You can survive 2 blocks. Mason glanced at the car, then back at Ethan. Walking then. They started down the sidewalk together. Mason's security remained, discreetly behind them, far enough away that the morning almost felt ordinary. At the coffee shop, they sat near the window. For 10 minutes, neither mentioned hospitals, medication, security, or rules. Ethan learned Mason hated cinnamon. Mason learned Ethan had become a nurse after spending too much of his childhood helping care for his grandfather. When Ethan finally checked the time, Mason did not ask him to stay. "You need sleep," Mason said. "That may be the first medically responsible thing you have ever said." Mason smiled. Ethan stood and reached for his coat. "Thank you for the coffee. Thank you for choosing to come." Ethan paused. The wording mattered. Mason seemed to know that now. As Ethan stepped toward the door, he realized something else had changed too. For the first time, Mason had entered Ethan's world without trying to rearrange it around himself. Over the next several weeks, Ethan discovered that Mason was capable of asking instead of arranging. Sometimes the invitation was coffee after Ethan's shift. Sometimes it was dinner at a small Italian restaurant in Greenwich Village, where nobody treated Mason like the most important person in the room. Once Ethan declined because he had worked 12 hours and wanted nothing except sleep. Mason simply said, "Another time," and meant it. That response mattered more than any expensive gesture could have. Mason continued his medical follow-up through the hospital without requesting Ethan as his nurse, keeping the boundary between Ethan's profession and their growing personal connection exactly where it belonged. Eventually, Ethan became the one who sent the first message. On a cold Saturday afternoon, they walked through Central Park beneath bare trees while Mason complained that Ethan's favorite coffee shop was apparently located several miles beyond civilization. "It is 6 blocks, Ethan said. "That is how civilization ends." Ethan laughed, and Mason looked quietly satisfied. Later, sitting across from each other beside the coffee shop window, Mason became serious. "I've been thinking about what you said in the hospital. I said many things you disliked. Most of them." Mason wrapped both, hand around his coffee cup, "especially what you said about one person becoming an entire category." Ethan waited. "I let one betrayal become proof that every Omega represented the same risk," Mason continued. "It was easier than admitting I trusted the wrong person." Ethan held his gaze. It was also unfair. Yes, there was no defense, no qualification. Just the answer. It was unfair. Ethan saw the importance immediately. Mason was not changing one rule because Ethan had somehow earned an exception. He was questioning the belief that had created the rule. Weeks later, Ethan stepped outside the hospital after another night shift and found Mason waiting beneath the glow of a street lamp. "Dinner?" Mason asked. "Are you asking or scheduling?" "Asking." Ethan pretended to consider it. Then yes. They walked toward the restaurant as Manhattan moved around them, bright windows reflecting against damp pavement. At the next crosswalk, the signal turned red. They stopped shoulder to shoulder. Mason looked at Ethan, then slowly extended one hand between them. He did not reach far enough to touch him. He simply opened his palm and waited. Ethan looked down at the offered hand. He remembered Suite 12, the guarded doorway, the rigid distance between them, and Mason watching every movement as though trust itself were dangerous. Now there was no hospital bed, no medical necessity, no emergency forcing a decision. There was only choice. Ethan placed his hand in Mason's. Mason's fingers closed gently around his, but he did not pull Ethan closer or change their distance. "You waited," Ethan said. "You taught me to." The pedestrian signal changed. They crossed together, neither walking ahead of the other. Halfway across the street, Mason glanced toward their joined hands. "I spent most of my life believing trust meant knowing exactly what someone would do." Ethan looked at him. "And now?" Mason's expression softened. "Now I think it means knowing they're free to leave and being grateful when they choose to stay." Ethan smiled and kept walking beside him. The city opened ahead, crowded and uncertain, offering no guarantees at all. For once, Mason did not seem interested in controlling what came next.